Now that we know how to grab raw HTML form data in Django, it's time to start adapting it to using just a basic Django form, so a pure Django form. So I'm actually going to, again, comment all of this out, copy it, and paste it over. Probably should have copied it first, but, whatever. Okay, so again, I'm going to go ahead and delete all this because we're basically starting from zero, or as if we were starting from zero. Okay, so I've got my view here, and then I want to open up forms again. Just go ahead and ignore this for now, but it is not a bad reference. So I'll just go ahead and say class raw product form, and it takes in forms.form. So it's not model form, just standard Django form. So with the standard Django form, we have to declare our inputs. So in my case, I've just been using model, but I can go further than that. And we use forms.char field, and we can say description, and we'll also do forms.char field as well. And then we will say price and forms.decimal field. So these should look very similar to our models, and that's because they are. So we've got our decimal field, char field, and we don't actually have text field. So if you try to do text field, it's not going to work. I'll discuss that later, but we'll just do char field. And honestly, if you wanted some reference for that, you just do Django form fields, and it should give you the field types in here. Right? So form fields, all of the various field types are in here. So you can absolutely use any of those, but text field is not there. So these all render out a specific look by default. So if I grab this form, bring it back into my view, or bring it into my view, not back into it, we have to render out this form. So to render it out, we create an instance of the form. So we'll say form is that. This creates an instance of that form, as you may be familiar with Python and how you create instances from a class. We add that form into our context. Okay, so again, we could say my form here, and then have form there. We're still going off that product create, so back in that HTML, I'm going to get rid of this here and just do form.as p. So this renders it out as paragraph text. So if we save this and take a look there, let's just refresh that page. I can inspect the element and take a look and see that, hey, we've got our form, we've got an action, we have our CSRF middleware token, that security token, we have some p tags in here, and that's as p. There's other ones like as HTML, or no, not as HTML, but as li, or is it ul, something like that. Yeah, there you go. So you can render it out as ul. It is HTML, so as HTML doesn't make sense. But as p is a way to render it out, and now we have a form with some data. So I can add in whatever I like, right, and hit save. Now, naturally, what just happened was we submitted the data to our form here, or at least it seemed like we did, but we didn't. We didn't do anything, right? So this form itself is just rendering out. It's not actually getting any of that data. And that's why we use request.post here. So if I save that just as is and refresh in here, let's just refresh in this page, and I see that now it's giving me these validation errors. These are called validation errors. This is awesome. This is built into Django. Right away, it's already validating stuff for me, unlike the HTML. The HTML absolutely was not. But it's asking, like, why are validation errors even happening at this point, right? So we see that this field is required, but how does Django already know that? Well, it has to do with what I initialize it with. So I have it in as request post. So let's make this work using kind of the long way at first. And we'll say if request.method equals to post. Right, so again, that's built into the request object itself that's being passed. So if the method is equal to post, then that's going to be my form. I'll actually use that data in my form. In other words, I'll pass in that request post data as I initialize my form. So I also have to initialize the form by default. So I need a get method for it, and that's where this comes in, right? So I render it for the get method so I can see what it looks like. And then with the post method, which is a different type of request, which means that I still have to render it for that different type of request. So we've got, this is roughly request.get, right? So that's what it's passing in by default, but request.get doesn't have anything, probably. So we'll go ahead and leave that out. And now this will actually handle my form data. So if I save this and I refresh in here and hit save, it's now saying, please fill out this form. And that is based off of my browser. See that it says required there. So if I actually removed that, right? So I literally removed it from the code in the elements. You don't have to do this. This is more illustration purpose. And hit save. It just moves to the next one. So again, I remove that. And then the final last one, all of those requireds, just remove it, and I hit save. Django now does the validation for me. Right, so I actually showed you a way that a user could potentially disrupt some of your raw HTML forms. And that's where Django's security comes in, not just for this, but also for this, right? So I absolutely need all of those things working. So I had all of those fields required, and this is a way to actually validate it. This does the validation. So there's a method called ifMyForm.isValid. This will actually say, hey, you have a valid form, now the data is good. And I'll explain the data part in just a second, but now that the data is good, we'll go ahead and print out myForm.cleanedData. So this would be the data that actually comes through from the form after it's been validated. Okay? And then we could also say print else myForm.errors. Okay? So we've got those two different methods. So if it's valid, then it's going to do that. If it's not valid, then it's going to print out what those errors are. Oftentimes you won't necessarily need this because the form itself, as we've already seen, renders out the problems that might be related to that form. And that's because of this right here too. So a lot of built-in features going on here that we're just not quite breaking down just yet. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Let's actually put in some valid data. So we come back in this create method. I'll say ABC, whatever, and whatever. I hit save, and nothing, that form doesn't re-render, which will solve that problem in a minute. But if we look in our terminal, we see, hey, here's our clean data. It actually gives us that data. And that error list did show up as well because we resubmitted the form and there were some errors. Okay, so what is another thing that we could do that would potentially cause some problems? What if I change this price field? What if I go to inspect element, change the type in the actual HTML to text? Right, so now I can actually type out text. I hit save. Hey, it's got to be a number. So that's other built-in validation that our forms actually have, right? So from this data, let's actually save an object. Let's actually do something that you would end up doing, right? We've got our product.objects.create, and we have some of that data that's coming through, right? We have a dictionary of this data, and it's doing title, description, and price, right? I named those fields on our form that way on purpose. It was to match our model, and that's what you should do as well. Because again, we're working towards this model form, and we're doing the long way. We're understanding more as to what's going on. Okay, so now that I've got that, I've got this create here. Well, what if I actually just passed in this data? So let's go ahead and pass in the clean data here, just like that. So I'm going to create it from that clean data. So let's go back in here, and I'll say new title, some description, some price. I hit save. And I get an error here, right? So what we can do is actually use the 2 stars here, and that will turn this into arguments that we're going to pass. So let's try it again. I hit save. No errors. Let's look at my back end, and I've got a bunch of new products with that exact same name. Cool. So I actually was able to save some data from my raw Django form that does some validation for me. Now, there are parameters and things that we can set in here. There's definitely a lot more that we can do with these fields, including rendering out how this description works. So we're going to dive a little bit more into that in the next one. Stay with us.